but what I'm going to do is mix it up a little bit. So I really want this to be interactive. Okay, so I will ask you to contribute in the chat at different points, and then we'll also invite you to come in if you'd like to ask a question or contribute to the discussion. Okay, so I hope that's okay. So we'll talk and explore and think about law as a tool and a system. And I guess very much from my point of view, and encouraging anyone to study law. Law is obviously a wonderful, subject area, but it's important that you critique the law as well, and that you have that critical lens. So I guess I want to bring some of that critique to the discussion today. And I know that many of you have been working with Janet, and you've already been thinking about law in practice through the enrichment program. So I'm sure you're familiar with that. And then we'll have an opportunity to talk about law as a career, what skills are needed, and so on. So as I said, very much want this to be interactive, engaging, and let's get on with that. So I'm going to start by showing you this visual. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of Lady Justice. So Lady Justice is often on the outside of a court, or various depictions of Lady Justice. Lady Justice is often blindfold and will often be, have a sword and a scales. And I just want you to think for a moment now about why Lady Justice is blindfold. You don't need to respond now, but maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so here is the kind of first interaction that I'd like you to get involved with. So obviously you've come here, lots of you have said, I'd like to study law, I'm interested in law, but what does law mean to you? What words come to mind when you think of the word law? And I'd like you to use the chat function now to contribute, and maybe Janet, you can kind of feed back some of the things that are coming in.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Some people are saying it's about justice, it's about courts.
Yeah.
Justice again, about crime.
Okay, brilliant.
Prosecution, crime.
Okay, so crime is coming up a lot, and that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because when we think of law, do we think of crime? Is that the first type of law that we think of? Okay, justice, a crime, prosecution was mentioned. Anything else? No?
Yeah, Yasmin has put legislation.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, so the form of law, where the law is actually coming from. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I mean, I think, yeah, they're the types of things. So that idea of legislation, justice, I think came up a lot. So often when we think of law, these are some of, I think, the words that come to our mind. So justice, I think, was one that a lot of you mentioned. You might also think of rules. So I think was it Jasmine said about legislation. So we think of rules, regulation. Does anyone, did anyone think about, well, does law mean equality? Does law mean fairness? Does law mean rights?
Maimuna, do you want to unmute your mic and say your one?
I was saying morality, you know how it's it kind of relates to what's right and wrong.
Excellent. Yeah. Did you want to add to that?
No.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to mention, morality. And of course, we could really explore that, couldn't we? And think, but whose morals, yeah? Who kind of decides what morality is as well. So I think you're right, though. I mean, if you look back at the kind of the genesis of law, we often see discussions in kind of jurisprudence around natural law. So what the right and the wrong. Okay, so that's a really, really important contribution. So thanks for that. So yes, I think when we think of law initially, we do think of it as the kind of the justice, don't we? But, is it always? So law as an instrument of liberation, freedom and justice. And I think that's what we would all hope that law is and kind of remains to be. However, and this is where I'm going to do the however, I also want you to think about, well, or is law an instrument of oppression, racism, sexism or power? Or is it all of those things? And again, I'd like you to contribute in the chat here. You might say just simply yes or no, or you might have an example of where you think law is also about oppression. So I'll give you a minute just to think there. So simply a yes or a no, or maybe is fine. And if anyone had an example that comes to mind, that would be great as well. And Janet, you can feed back to me, because I'm not actually seeing the chat, whatever way my screen is set up.
That's fine.
Do we have any responses?
Okay, 1 second. Okay, Jose, would you like to unmute your mic, please?
Yeah, I've said that law is not objectively oppressive, but very much so there are examples in the past and maybe even today where oppressive law, like what you talked about, racism or sexism, there are laws which are preventing that from like progress to being made, basically.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So there, I guess you're saying there are examples of that. Yeah, I was interested in when you said the word objectively. Yeah, I think that's really good. Thank you. Okay, anyone else want to contribute
Rosie,
there?
would you like to unmute your mic and share, please?
My point is similar to Jose's. Like I stated that it really depends on the time period we're talking about. So a lot has changed in the last 40 or 30 years. So with the introduction of new technology, I guess through media, through change of opinions as well.
Mm. Is that always a good thing, do you think? So when you say media, maybe are you thinking of social media as well?
I think it depends, because the media can also be used for a bad thing as well, so like propaganda or false information, or it can, so it really depends on the situation whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Brilliant. Anyone else want to contribute, or we can move on?
Yeah, there's no others at the moment.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you for that. I mean, I was interested in the contributions there that talked about a lot has changed and said, there has been progress, but I think also some of these issues remain deeply problematic. And so obviously, I'm sure you've been following the news and you will have seen the guilty verdict in the US yesterday for George Floyd's murder. But I think, of course, everybody was, on tenterhooks about how that verdict would go. David Alan Green is a kind of prominent commentator. He's on Twitter, if any of you are on Twitter and want to follow him. But what he said was, the evidence was overwhelming, but because it was a white police officer who killed a black person, nobody at all knew which way the jury would go. And he said, this is what systemic racism looks like. So whilst there has been progress, I think, there are obviously still deeply problematic issues in terms of racism within the law, or how the law is structured and how the law works. So I think for anyone interested in studying law, I really encourage you, you need to be challenging the law as well, and challenging the status quo and how the law operates. So it might often present itself as, universal, it's on the basis of justice, fairness, and it's equal to all, but of course it's not. And we need to ask why. So I framing, always think about how things are framed and presented. Okay. Legal decision making is always framed, okay, by facts, by law, by policies or purposes and values, and the frame determines the invisibility or visibility of differentiated impact on different people. We might say insiders and outsiders. More recently, again, I'm sure you've all been following in the news all of this. Obviously, the tragic death of Sarah Everard, and then the vigil, and all of these discussions around Kill the Bill. So I don't know if any of you have been out protesting or anything, but involved in that. But again, the framing of some of these, this picture is not a criticism or a derogatory in any way to Kate Middleton. But what I want us to think about is the framing here. And how things are framed. And I think was it Jasmine? I think earlier you talked about the role of the media. Okay. The Kill the Bill. How many of you are aware or following this discussion? Is there anyone would like to kind of jump in or make a comment on this? And what are the aspects of that are problematic? Or why are people protesting about this bill? Anyone familiar with it? I'll give you a second, and if not, don't worry. So there is a bill before the House. Yeah, sorry, is there someone wants to come in?
Yeah, so the Kill the Bill, so it's the bill in itself, it's going through the current government regulations. So the idea is it's going to boost powers of the police. So like static process, so they can intervene with protests and actually have more powers regarding what to do with protesters, like send them to court or what other cases they want to do with them.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a huge bill, and again, I'd encourage anyone to, you can do a very quick search on Google, bills before Parliament, and you can have a look at any bills that are going through the Houses of Parliament at the moment. So the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill is at the committee stage now. But as you pointed out, I don't know who was speaking there, but it provides a lot of additional powers for the police.
That was Rosie.
Rosie, brilliant. Limiting the right to protest. And, the visual that I've just added to the slide here, people are saying that this is, we're becoming more of an authoritarian state and no to a police state. And, it raises questions about civil liberties, so you'll see the poster there. It's a monstrous assault on our civil liberties.
Okay,
so
Shante, would you like to unmute your mic and make your point?
I think Rosie said most of what is.
That's okay.
Basically
you can
about,
share.
But,
you can share.
Yeah, please do.
I was just going to say that even though there's a lot of stuff in the bill, but the reason why I feel people are against it is because it's taken away people's rights to protest, and I don't think that if we're in a democracy, that should happen.
Absolutely. And so, again, it's those questions of what rights or what do we value, so, I guess we all recognize that, we know that the role of the police is hugely important, etc. And there's, rights there as well. But it's that kind of, I suppose, conflict between values of what rights are more important and so on.
Okay. Jose, would you like to unmute your mic and also share?
Yeah, I didn't see it on the slide, but I kind of just reiterated, like, it was criticized for increasing sentences on kind of futile things like damaging statues, and that's kind of like, especially what was happening at the time, it's kind of like, how do you say it? It's like useless, like, there's no point of that being inside the bill.
Yeah. So when you say the statutes, again, kind of the response to the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and the the statue that was knocked down in Bristol, wasn't it? What was one of the kind of high profile ones. So yeah, 10 years for damaging memorials, it's bizarre, isn't it? But again, as you've pointed out there, what is speaking there? What's the frame there? So brilliant. Thank you for your contributions on that. And, you know, let's watch this space and how this is going to go. Obviously, we know the protests are continuing. Okay, I thought it would be just worth as well highlighting the particular impact on, you know, younger, let's say, protesters or voters. We know that there's been a huge, I suppose, momentum behind climate change. And here is just a visual and some commentary from one. So Dominique, 21, is a student and climate activist. And, you know, she's very much critiquing the bill as well. Protests are supposed to be disruptive. That's what a protest is about. So yeah, just I think thinking about the different movements, and obviously the Sarah Everard movement, you know, raised a lot of questions about violence against women, etc. But of course, we also need to ask, well, why was there such an outrage about Sarah Everard's death, you know, and not about other women? Women of color, you know, why was there the outrage? And so, you know, we always need to be asking these questions. Okay, so I think, Jose, this may be, I was thinking of this visual when you spoke earlier, who is policed and criminalized and who is not. You know, I don't know, again, if you've been following some of the news, maybe we're all a bit fatigued by COVID news, but there's a lot of focus at the moment on Matt Hancock, the, you know, Minister for Health and Social Care, and it seems to be quite, you know, these kind of corruptive processes in terms of who got these contracts and so on. And, you know, why isn't he being, you know, why isn't there a focus on his actions? So again, always question and always challenge. Okay, this is just a simple question. I'm sure we've already had some of this. When we're thinking about the law, where do we get our law from in this country? So somebody earlier said,
Rosie's got a little comment here. Rosie,
yeah, brilliant. Jump in, Rosie. And again, apologies because I'm not seeing the chat. I don't know whatever way my screen is set up. So Rosie, please jump in.
Oh no, it's just something really small. I just wrote the contract is talking about Matt Hancock. Like, it's circulating in the news recently that he actually gave a contract to his sister's company. Yeah. So I'm sure, as we all know, with politics especially, like connections are the most important thing regarding family as well. So there's criticisms regarding him giving those contracts to his family members.
Yeah. And why? Yeah, but why, Rosie? Can you just kind of unpack that a bit more? Like, why is it problematic?
I guess it's the same thing as Boris's girlfriend as well. So Carrie Simmons gave her a £300 an hour part-time job. Yeah. So people are saying that her friend is actually qualified for the job, but she didn't put it out, like she didn't put the job out for other people to see, and it was given to her best friend straight away. And I guess they're just doing this because, I mean, if you had the opportunity to, why wouldn't you help your family? But the question here is about legitimacy and whether it's fair or not on people who aren't related to them.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's nepotism, isn't it? It's just wrong. It's not, you know, there's conflict of interest, you know, there's ethical questions there to be raised and so on. And it's about transparency, isn't it? You know, these people are in government, they've been elected by the, you know, by society, and they should act in a particular way. Brilliant. So sources of law, again, I think we've had, was it Yasmin or someone, I can't remember earlier, where do we get our law from? So can anyone just again jump in here and tell us, where do we get our law from in this country? Somebody said legislation earlier.
Yeah, I said I think our law is governed by our morals. So it's kind of, it comes from a natural understanding that of what is right and wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the kind of the premise of it, but then how is the law made, if that makes sense? So, you know, who makes the law? I guess I should have maybe asked it in that way. So we have
Yasmin?
Yeah.
Oh, I wrote down that the laws are made by a group of people called, the Parliament.
Parliament, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, so in this jurisdiction, which we might call the English legal system, there are two main sources of law.
And Brunilda has a question.
Yeah, perfect. Brunilda?
Okay, I can ask it. She's put European Union law, question mark.
Oh, okay, good question. Brilliant. Okay, so maybe if I just go, let's talk about this first, what's on the slide. So we might say there's two main sources of law. So Parliament, obviously the House of Commons and the House of Lords, that's where Parliament or legislation goes through both houses, and we have legislation. Okay, so rules, laws that are set out by Parliament. But also in this jurisdiction, this is a common law jurisdiction, which I'm sure many of you might have heard. So case law is also a form or a source of law, right? So case law and legislation. EU law, well, who can answer that question? EU law obviously had a huge impact on lawmaking in this jurisdiction, but now with Brexit, etc., it's no longer, there has been kind of transition periods, and the one of the key pieces of legislation at the time or the date of Brexit, any law that was based on EU law became domestic law, okay? But we will no longer be EU law will no longer be supreme in this jurisdiction. Okay, so good question about EU law. The other kind of European law that we should be aware of is the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. The European Convention on Human Rights is also really important. So the Human Rights Act, which is a domestic law, tells us that the European Convention of Human Rights should be applied in this jurisdiction, okay? So the European Convention on Human Rights is still applicable. Some people confuse that and they say, oh, that's not applicable because the EU law is one thing, ECHR is another thing. Okay, so on this point, I guess case law and judge-made law is hugely important in this jurisdiction. And then, so another question or another frame that we need to be challenging is representation within the judiciary. So the next slide I want to show you, these are the Supreme Court justices. Lady Rose was just appointed to the Supreme Court this week, actually, on Monday. You might have seen that. So what are your observations? Any comments in the chat?
Okay, one second.
Sorry, Janet,
no worries. Okay, I think, okay. Ashante, would you like to unmute your mic and pretty much say what everyone else is saying?
That is mostly men that are there.
Yeah.
Yep, and Jose?
Yeah, there's not a lot of diversity between the justices.
Not a lot at all, not even. Yeah, absolutely. And what about age, demographic? Yeah, so again, have a look at the Supreme Court website, and you can see the biographies there of the justices. So yeah, I think it's just worth us kind of reflecting on this. What's your response to this? Okay, so you've made your observations. Now dig a bit deeper. What are your thoughts about this? How do you feel about this group of people being our most, our highest judiciary in this country? Are you happy with this? Not happy with this?
Okay, Sinead, would you like to unmute your mic?
No, because I don't think that there's there's no representation anyway, but there's no representation of the people that are being affected by the law anyway. So they're all just, well, apart from the two women, just white middle-aged men that what they're talking about doesn't even really affect them. They're never gonna be affected by anything anyway. So I don't think that it really
what do you mean by that? That they're never going to be affected?
I think that the level they're at,
right,
they can manipulate the law into what they want it to be, so that they don't face the same things that other people do. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so.
Just being devil's advocate for a moment, like, I think the word that manipulate is quite a strong word. I know what you mean, but of course the other argument people would say, oh, but they're all, you know, they're there on merit, they're really good jurists, you know, they're very academically sound, they've worked up through the profession. What would your response to that be?
I mean, I can understand where that argument comes from, but I think when you're in any type of position of power at that level, you can pull the strings to how you want to. I think in anything, to be honest. So.
Yeah, I guess it's, but you know, whether it's even about pull the strings, but it's about what your own positionality is, isn't it? So, yeah. Is Lord Stevens going to be able to see things in the same way as, you know, probably not, you know, and so it's that kind of lens and framing. So representation is important, isn't it? Diversity is important.
Thank you. Rosie, would you like to unmute your mic, please?
I was going to link this to Sinead's point about them being able to interpret and their morals, how they seem right, because so the UK, along with New Zealand and Israel, is the only, well, part of the only 3 countries have an uncodified constitution, so unwritten constitution. So America, for example, is codified, which means that, like, the judges can't interpret particular things how they want it to be. It's fixed. So even though the Supreme Court does have a lot of power in America, they still can't interpret the way they want to. Whereas the problem in the UK is we don't have that. So because it's uncodified, senior judges have the ability to interpret it the way they want to. And as much as we would like to think that they're neutral, independent, they're not. And I think that's a problem that isn't really talked about.
That's a really
a superpower alongside Israel in the same idea, not having a codified constitution, which doesn't make sense.
Okay. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, there is another kind of side of that as well. I mean, a lot of other commentary out there would say, well, where are the power dynamics? So you obviously have Parliament and then you have the judiciary, right? So a lot of people have been saying, commentators saying, actually the Supreme Court in this jurisdiction is quite active, and it's called judicial activism. That's what it's called in the commentary. You know, when you see the judiciary pushing back against the government. So if we look at the recent cases, the high profile Supreme Court cases around Brexit, I don't know if any of you recall those, but you might have seen as well some of the headlines in the tabloid newspapers about judges being enemies of the people. Did anybody ever see those headlines? So it's an interesting argument. I'm not critiquing it completely, but there's also an argument that actually the judiciary are doing activism, kind of pushing back against government. But yeah, very, very good points there. And
Jose,
good kind of...
would you like to unmute your mic, please?
I just stated that have they like acknowledged this kind of issue that we've kind of looking at?
I missed that. Sorry, was it Jose?
Yeah, I just said have they had they not acknowledged it? Like have they seen that?
Who's they? Who are you asking? Who's they acknowledged it?
The Supreme Court as an institution, like have they acknowledged this issue?
About diversity or lack of?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. There has been some kind of high profile, you know, speeches or commentary by some of the Supreme Court judges. calling for greater diversity, etc. But it's been very slow. You know, there is more diversity in some of the tribunals and some of the lower courts, but it's still deeply problematic at the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court level. Some of you might remember Lady Hale. She was quite high profile Supreme Court judge. She's no longer on the bench, but she would have been, you know, advocating a lot about diversity. And so it is being discussed, but I guess the problem is we don't know whether, you know, how much of that is kind of tokenistic and how much of it is real. But I think, you know, this picture or this slide definitely demonstrates that there's a lot of work to be done. Okay, I'm going to move on in the interest of time, but thank you for your contributions. So, you know, what we've been kind of looking at here is the ways that law is capable of serving as an instrument of oppression and domination, and also, I guess, the structures of law, you know. So we can talk about law in terms of the rules, the legislation, but then there's the operation of law, the application of law, okay? So one area, and there's obviously, again, a very kind of high profile area and a lot of focus, is immigration law. And you know, we know that there's been a huge focus on this in terms of Brexit and, you know, kind of anti-immigration you know, rhetoric. This is a book by Nadine El-Ani. It's a brilliant book called Bordering Britain, and in that she describes immigration law in this jurisdiction as a form of violence. So law as violence, or law as violence. And so she talks about law as violence in the context of immigration law as dual. So it serves as the means of obstruction of the vast majority of racialized people from accessing wealth. Okay, and also it's the primary means, or, you know, law is the kind of barrier, if you like, for those people also seeking legal status. So I think it's just worth, I feel like that, you know, the use of the language here, law can be actually violent, and we might think that's a bit strange. You know, law is about protecting against violence, but it can also be violent. So other forms of law as violence or law as violence, you know, thinking about the death of George Floyd, obviously, but the form of police brutality in the US and the UK. I don't know if anybody has any comments on this. I mean, obviously, we know that there was a lot of the rhetoric here. Well, oh, that doesn't happen here. That only happens in the US. And I've referenced there to the Lamy review, and Janet and I were just chatting earlier, and I think some of you on the program have hopefully will be getting an opportunity to have hear David speak. Does anybody have any response to this kind of this argument or rhetoric around that only happens in the US argument? No? No? Okay. We'll just take it that
I can I want to link it to politics.
Yeah.
So we're talking about police brutality, but I think politics also plays a massive factor in how laws are made govern. I mean, obviously they do.
Yeah.
So when I'm reading like the stop and search text that's on here, it says that it was a key cause of tensions in reports after the 1981 Brixton riots. And I think if we go back to that time, we need to concentrate on conservatism and Thatcherism. So Thatcher, she was really big on the police, and her government actually increased like a lot of police wages and backed them against like most cases as well. So we could say how politics has a massive impact on it. And apart from that, it's like at the political ideologies of each party, it shows why they give more support to one particular thing. So if Labour was in government, they'd cut funding for police departments and etc. When it's Conservatives, it actually works to their advantage, because there's a certain stereotype of a conservative supporter, so like, oh, they're most likely racist, and that actually goes against with the laws they implement. So from funding the police more to carry out these kind of things, like it's part of their.
Yeah, sorry to cut across you. I mean, I agree with you in part, but actually Labour are also, and there's been lots of examples of Labour being very heavy-handed with, you know, kind of increased powers for the police, etc. So I, you know, appreciate that kind of traditional argument and Conservative are, you know, more authoritarian in terms of police, but I think Labour also, particularly during the kind of the New Labour.
I know you're talking about Blair, how he said tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Blair did that because he wanted to gain support from both sides, and that's how New Labour began. We can't really compare the extremes of both sides. Blair only said tough on crime, tougher on crime, tough on the causes of crime, because he wanted to gain support from both parties, and knowing that after Thatcher and Major, he had to do something like that. So that's why New Labour implemented something like that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I appreciate your point. I think it's very well made, but I guess it's just that Labour are not innocent either, I don't think. And I think that's what's deeply problematic in this country. I mean, Keir Starmer at the moment, I don't think he, you know, he's not kind of coming out that the person we thought, you know, his response to the kind of Bristol riots, etc., has been problematic. But I take I do agree with your point broadly, but I think sometimes we allow Labour to kind of off the hook as well, if that makes sense. But I do accept your point in the main. Okay. So yeah, I mean, just I'm conscious of time. I mean, on the stop and search, obviously, just in terms of lockdown, there was a, you know, focus on that as well. Who was being stopped more so within COVID times. And then this slide, I won't dwell on it again, but I guess we're just talking about the application of law. So law's application in sentencing. And here you'll see these are US examples. So I note that, but I think they're also worthy to reflect on. So just, I guess we've been focusing more, or I have been, so maybe that's my positioning as well. But in what ways could we argue that law is capable of serving as an instrument of liberation, freedom and justice? And of course, we have, I'm sure, lots of examples of that as well. So would anyone like to jump in here? I mean, again, just unmute and jump in quickly if you like, so we can keep the conversation moving. Anyone kind of think of examples of where law has been, you know, or shown to be an instrument of liberation, freedom, or cases? I mean, do we think about the case in the US as liberatory now, or not? Anyone have any thoughts on this?
It's kind of hard to argue because I guess like for your example is predominantly about racism. So we take like the 1960s in America and the whole civil rights movement.
Yeah.
I guess you could say that yes, law did liberate and provide some more justice in terms of like giving equal opportunity to like African Americans, for example.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that was only achieved through like the means of protest. So it's kind of, I don't know, I'm a bit new.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's on one level you're challenging the law, but you're also seeking the law to bring about change. So I think, you know, that's both historical and, you know, in the current climate, you know, so where we're thinking of law has been oppressive, but we also want to use the instrument of law to be liberatory. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, unless anyone else wants to jump in here, one, of course.
Right. This might sound a bit skeptical, but could we not argue that law and liberation could actually, well, law along with liberation, freedom and justice could actually be oxymorons? So like two words are next to each other that have the complete opposite meaning. I feel like with law, because it includes morality as well, it's really difficult for it to also be on the same level as liberation, freedom and justice. Like law is such a concept, in my opinion, where it's always going to be unfair. We as human beings cannot do anything about it. We all have different opinions. And even with opinions, like if I said, for example, by the way, this is just an example, guys. If I just said, for example, segregation is good, black people should do this, white people should do that, then of course I'm going to get criticized. And there's going to be people who have the same opinion as me, and there's also going to be people who disagree with me. Now, is that an infringement of my freedom, of my? So you could argue that law and freedom can go in opposite directions.
Yeah, I mean, the
By
freedom,
the way, I don't actually think like that. PS, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, at the freedom of expression or freedom of speech issue, I mean, we could probably speak about that for hours, and it's really interesting, I think, how that's being used at the moment. You know, particularly right-wing politics is using freedom of speech or freedom of expression argument, but I feel like it's being used in a very particular way. So I think that, you know, yeah, it's a difficult one. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it is a complex thing. But I think law can be liberatory. Of course, it can as well. We've seen lots of examples of that historically. But as you said, it can be both, I think. So I will move on just in interests of time. You know, human rights law obviously would be one where people say, yes, human rights law, it has been a positive thing, but of course, lots of people say it's negative as well. But there have been, you know, some high profile landmark cases, human rights cases that have transformed Britain, not my words, but used by others. You know, there's so many, you know, fundamental human rights. Freedom of speech or expression was noted there, but of course, counter to that is you know, free to be free from inhumane and degrading treatment, right to privacy, etc. Two landmark cases concerning the UK. You had A and others. This was a case concerning unlawful detention. So following 9/11, you know, the Twin Towers attack in the US, the UK government started imprisoning suspected terrorists indefinitely. So they were being held indefinitely without a criminal charge. And this case went all the way to the House of Lords at the time, the judicial branch of the House of Lords, and it was held that breached the right to liberty. Smith and Grady is another high-profile UK case, which concerned 4 gay men and women. They were dismissed from the armed forces, and the European Court of Human Rights decided that their right to privacy had been violated. Okay, so again, these are just 2 examples. If you want to read up a little bit more about human rights cases and some of the big human rights cases from the UK, Rights Info is a really good resource, and it's very accessible, and they use lots of infographics and things like that. So I'd have a look at that if you're interested in that. So I'm going to kind of sum up, because I know we obviously want to talk a bit about careers, obviously. So where does that leave us? Well, I think, you know, I think it was Rosie, isn't it? I can't remember if it's Rosie, but yeah, you know, law as a tool and a construct is complex. Law can be and is both a tool of oppression, but it can be a liberatory tool as well. So if anyone's thinking about entering into the legal profession or studying law in university, need to think about law critically, okay? It is necessary to examine law's social, political and economic consequences, and by doing so opens up a whole range of arguments and issues that we might not consider if our thinking and lens stops short of just a technical analysis of the rules themselves, okay? I'll jump on from here. So law as a career and as a profession and a career. I guess, first of all, I mean, maybe we won't do this today, but you can think about this afterwards, maybe take out a post-it note and jot down some answers to this. So what skills do you need for law, do you think? And what skills would you need for the legal profession? So there are many, of course, and I mean, lots of transferable skills as well. Okay. In terms of a career in law, I mean, again, I'm sure you'll have heard lots of this already, but I guess what I want to just emphasize today is that you know, taking law as a university degree, and thinking about, you know, law as a career, obviously, you know, the kind of the go-to, or the ones that we know, are going down, becoming a solicitor or a barrister. But I must point out that the reality is that there actually aren't enough, you know, places, you know, there just aren't enough, you know, there aren't enough places for solicitors and barristers. So the amount of students that study law and then go into becoming a solicitor and barrister, they're not equivalent, right? That doesn't mean that law isn't a good degree, nor does it mean that there aren't other options. So taking law as a university degree opens up a wide range of opportunities for you. And also, I would just say, it is a very well recognized degree. Okay, so you can go, if you don't want to go down the legal practice route, you can go into research, journalism, work in NGOs, work as an in-house lawyer, a teacher, an academic. Okay, so don't forget about that. You know, do you want to be a future teacher or a lecturer? You could work in government, work in the civil service. So there are, you know, there are more options than just going down the solicitor barrister route. I'm not saying not to pursue those, but I think don't limit yourself to that thinking and that frame, you know. And I guess also what I just want to say, and in building on our conversations today, and I can see from your contributions that
Veronica,
you all...
Can you quickly explain to them what an NGO is, please?
A non-government organization. So non-government, so, you know, kind of might be based on charity work, or, you know, like that example I showed you earlier. So an organization that is trying to champion rights, maybe. So an organization that's working on, you know, say violence against women or something like that. So you can work in different organizations that campaign and champion, and they would do a lot of work then when they would maybe contribute to government reports or challenge them and so on. So does that make sense? So a non-government organization. So, you know, you're not working in government, then you're kind of championing rights outside of government. Okay. Any other questions on this slide?
No.
No? Okay. So I guess the other thing, I guess I just would like to say then, thinking of studying law at the university, I guess I'd encourage you to ask yourself why. You know, law is a very well recognized degree. It's very high profile, but I would like you to think and ask, why am I doing this? So is it so that you can challenge, you know, what we've been just talking about today, to challenge the status quo, you know, to fight against oppression? So think about why you want to study law. And of course, there is such a wide area and variety of areas of law. You know, you might be interested in music. Do you want to work in the music industry? You might be interested in kind of IP, copyright. I don't know if any of you were following the Colin the Caterpillar cake debacle this week, but that was essentially about intellectual property rights. So I know Janet, I'm probably gone over time. Us Irish people tend to yap on, but I guess I'd just like to finish with, you know, should you study law? Would I say law is a brilliant degree, a brilliant area of law? Yes, 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 I would absolutely say that. We need more passionate, inspiring, engaging, youthful lawyers to, you know, to challenge the status quo. But, you know, but be clear about why you want to do it, I guess. Okay, Janet, I'm going to finish there.
Okay, let me just end the recording.